Hi, welcome to CHI's Masters of Suspicion class. This is week 2 on our class on Kafka. I call it Complicity here. My notes have Resigning Oneself to Power. The titles are rather arbitrary at times. I do what I can to kind of guide things through. Resigning Oneself to Power is probably a better title for the class today, though. And that's what we'll be talking about. A little bit of review from last week for those of you who weren't here. Last time we explored the Great Wall of China and in the penal colony to examine 2 different truths about power. The first story focused on the relation between narrative and power and the need for a population to believe in order to become intimately touched by the force of empire. It discussed the difficulty of creating a sense of unity in the presence of vast diversity, especially given barriers of space and time. So that was the Great Wall, half a class. And then the second story talked about how everyone within a system, even visitors, remain implicated in its power structures. Nobody is innocent and nobody is free. Entering into a system is agreeing to participate within its power framework. Further, in modern society, power becomes increasingly abstracted. It moves from those who are able to found it, the founders like the ex-commandant, or the former commandant was, or the old one, into the hands of machines, and to those who tend the very machines that they themselves become subjected to. It's a really creepy allegory of how power works in that way. But that was last week. For this week, we're going to be looking at The Trial. The Trial is one of Kafka's unfinished novels. Before his death, he gave his manuscripts to his friend Max Brod, who he commanded to destroy them. He left them there in spite of his friend's refusal to comply, which leaves open the question of whether he really wanted to have his writings burnt or not. Or whether he just wanted to tell himself that he did. So that's kind of an open question that scholars debate in different ways. There's a rough and unfinished quality to the book, but it doesn't really get in the way of one's enjoyment of it. And in fact, a lot of the episodic kind of structures, I think, work really well in the nightmarish logic that stitches the book together. My focus in finding a path through the text is going to be to highlight the points of K's weakness. It's a weakness that he unwisely attempts to compensate for through arrogance. And I think those of you who read through the first chunk can see that pretty clearly. All right. The 4 weaknesses that I'll just put out at the very beginning before going into the text are as follows. Number 1, he submits to the judgments and opinions of others. Number 2, he exercises power against those whom he feels are lower than him. Number 3, his relationships with women are rather skewed. He exploits them sexually and for his own gain. And number 4, he has an inability to do anything truly wrong, which the first sentence tells us. He embodies mediocrity and inauthenticity. He doesn't know or care about the kind of person that he is. So that's how we'll start things.
Could you repeat 2?
Yeah, number 2, he exercises power against those whom he feels are lower than he is.
Thank you.
Underlings. Minions, perhaps. All right. And with that, let's delve into the trial. I'm using the page numbers that I talk about are going to be from this translation. I'm pretty sure that's still it has a different cover, but I'm pretty sure that's the translation that a lot of you have. For the rest of you, I don't know what page number it's going to be, but hopefully you can kind of follow along. On page 3, the first sentence starts out, "Someone must have slandered Joseph K. For one morning, without having done anything truly wrong, he was arrested." It's one of the more famous sentences in 20th century literature, notably for its ambiguity. Someone must have slandered refers to an amorphous they of society, right? There's no particular person. There's no one person that he's wronged in particular. It's just one of the vast someone, what they would do. Must have slandered offers the pretense of an explanation for a course of events without any substantiation behind it. It's a must-have that implies it's necessary, but there's no necessity behind it, right? It's as though the narrator's grasping at straws because there's an event that happens, right? Like he's arrested, and the fact of the arrest makes the narrator presuppose that there has to be a cause. The cause is a case of slander. But all we know is this, right? He's arrested. And so the must-have appears as out of nowhere. And the being linked to slander is even more tenuous, if that makes sense. And then the terms truly wrong come from the German term böse, or evil. It contextualizes guilt in terms of the worst crimes instead of potentially ordinary ones, right? So without ever having been evil, he's arrested. You know, that truly wrong has that really sense of truly wrong, malevolence, right? If it wasn't malevolent, so why is he being arrested? Nobody knows. Or at least the narrator doesn't. Kay himself doesn't. All right, so does that help with the opening sentence at least? And what I'll do through here is just kind of jump through to different points of the text that I find kind of compelling or interesting to kind of anchor your reading as you go through, and then move on from there. So on page 4, the narrator writes, although he realized at once that he shouldn't have spoken aloud, and that by doing so he had, in a sense, acknowledged the stranger's right to oversee his actions, that didn't seem important at the moment. Still, the stranger took it that way. Right? And it's one of those really subtle moments or transfers of power where you acknowledge somebody else's right to monitor your own behavior or actions. Right? And Kay is caught in one of those moments. So it seems like dream logic in one kind of way, but it's also a substantial acknowledgement that somebody else has the right to have power over you that's done verbally. Contrast this with the earlier discussion of the warder. So there's been a warder on the scene before. The man ignored the question as if his presence would have to be accepted and merely said in turn, you rang. The man didn't submit to his inspection for long. So on the one hand, bless you. Bless you again. On the one hand, you have Kay, who acknowledges the right of somebody else to have power, right? Whereas the warder offers the reader an immediate point of contrast, right? The warder doesn't submit to his authority. His presence has to be accepted, and he doesn't submit to Kay's inspection for long, right? There's a difference. There's a contrast between there, and that's somehow involved in what the trial is doing. I mean, this is the first 2 pages of the novel, so it seems as though Kafka's intent on making that kind of distinction clear. Does that make sense? Okay. Page 6. Kafka writes, Kay attached little value to whatever right he might still have over the disposal of his things. It was much more important to him to gain some clarity about his situation, but he couldn't even think in the presence of these men. What sort of men were they? What office did they represent? After all, Kay lived in a state governed by law. There was universal peace. All statutes were in force. Who dared assault him in his own lodgings? He'd always tended to take things lightly, to believe the worst only when it arrived, making no provision for the future even when things looked bad. But that didn't seem the right approach here. Right? So the narrator is giving us a little bit of background into Kay's psychology and how he orients himself toward the world. Right? On the one hand, he wants to look at the stability of the social structure to say that what's happening is impossible. Right? There's no reason for any of this to happen. He hasn't done anything truly wrong. All these laws are in force. Everything's okay. On the other hand, he's generally been one to be liked. He doesn't think about things. He doesn't look at why things are important. He doesn't measure the future in terms of its significance. He just kind of goes along with the flow. He's that kind of guy. And even though he realizes that there's a significance or a meaningfulness to what's going on here that makes that the wrong approach, he doesn't have an alternative approach. That's all he knows how to do. Does that make sense? Okay. Page 10. Page 10 makes a weird jump. It brings up suicide as a reaction to power. It's just a little glimpse, but it's an odd one. So here's what he says. Here's the narrator. Kay was surprised, at least from the guard's perspective, that they had driven him into his room and left him alone there, where it would be 10 times easier to kill himself. And given the scope of the trial, that seems like a weird jump for Kay to have to think through, right? I mean, you have these weird guys who just burst into your room, say you're under arrest, they have there's no state power behind them, nothing's going on, and his immediate thought is, wow, I could kill myself and that'd be very easy. I don't know that everybody would jump to that conclusion. Kay does, right? And so there's something about how Kay responds to the presence of power that he doesn't control, that makes him want to die. The narrator continues. At the same time, he asked for himself from his own perspective what possible reason he could have for doing so. So he brings up the possibility that nobody else introduces, and then he takes it away by saying, I'm not that kind of person. Then he continues, because those two were sitting next door and had taken away his breakfast, Committing suicide would be so irrational that even had he wished to, the irrationality of the act would have prevented him. Okay, so he wants to look at himself as a reasonable person. He understands that that impulse is irrational, therefore he won't do it, but it's still an impulse, right? And there's something about needing to have autonomy, which a philosopher named Theodor Adorno defines as the right to refuse. Having the right to refuse is autonomy. And so K responds to a diminution of his autonomy in terms of wishing he were dead. Not really, not quite, not exactly, but it brings up the thought of not being alive to him. And there's something, I think there's something Kafka is getting at with that. The need to have autonomy in order to have control or desire for the perpetuation of one's own existence. Does that make sense? Okay. All right, moving forward. So the whole way, I mean, part of what is going on, especially in the new translator, Breon Mitchell, is he emphasizes the performative aspect of everything that's going on. Terms that could be used one way, he translates as actors, as setting the stage, as trotting the boards. And a lot of this points to the presence of audiences for whom Kafka's, or not Kafka, but K is increasingly acting out things for. So on page 15, we get a little glimpse of this. The narrator says, across the way, the group was still at the window, their peaceful observation now slightly disturbed as K stepped to the window. The old couple started to rise, but the man behind them calmed them down. There's more of the audience over there, K cried out to the inspector. And so K's aware that he's being watched, and he's aware at some level he has to perform for the crowds. Right? It's important that his performance be known and be noticed. And we'll talk about a few of those other performances as we continue through the first 3 chapters of the text. At the same time, being watched, on the one hand, you're performing for an audience, but as a performer, the audience has some amount of power over you. You're always being watched. You're always being surveilled. There are always witnesses there against you, ready to testify at what you're doing or not doing. And so what Kafka does at the one hand is try to give K a little bit of power as a performer over his audience, and on the other hand to suggest that there's always an audience for his action. He's always under surveillance. Everybody's watching him all the time, and that's kind of a frightening thought. I don't know, I'm pretty big. People tend to notice me in public. It's really hard to hide when they're 6'5" and have a big beard and stuff. You know, it's tough. And you get that sense that you're always under observation, and it's frightening. It's scary. It's scary to know. All right, go on to page 23. He talks to Frau Grubach, his landlord, and Fräulein Bursner, who's another lodger in the building. And with Frau Grubach, he says this: "If I'd behaved more sensibly, nothing more would have happened. Everything else would have been nipped in the bud. At the bank, for instance, I'm always prepared. Nothing like this could have ever happened to me there. I have my own assistant, the office phone, and my outside line stand before me at the desk. But even more importantly, I'm always involved in my work, so I have my wits about me. Well, it's all over now. I just wanted to hear your judgment on the matter, the judgment of a sensible woman, and I'm glad that we agree." Right? So the first thing that he claims is he differentiates his public self versus his private self. And what he wants to be able to say is that in his private residence, his wits are scrambled more easily. As a public figure, entrenched in power, and look how much power is dripping, right? He has an assistant, he has a door, he has an outside line, he has a phone. He has all these kinds of things to shield him from any external force, right? And through the use of those shields or defenses, he's able to keep at bay others, right? And you get the sense that he's almost like a little castle, right? He's in the middle here, you know, he has the palace, and there's a castle wall that surrounds him and protects him from outsiders. And from that place of protection, he'd be able to ward off anybody coming in his way, right? So that's the first thing that he intimates. Whereas in his private space, he doesn't have that kind of protection available because he's just him. And he's weaker there. The other thing that he asks, though, is for Frau Grubach's judgment. I wanted your judgment on the matter, the judgment of a sensible woman, and I'm glad we agree. And he takes it a step farther. He wants to shake hands. And for him, her shaking hands with him becomes a kind of acknowledgement that the officers who arrested him didn't offer. So he says, page 24, "Will she shake my hand? The inspector didn't." "Don't take it so hard, Herr K," she said, forgetting, of course, to shake his hand. "I didn't realize I was taking it hard," K said, suddenly weary and realizing how worthless the woman's assent was. Two problems come up. Number one, he requests external validation for his own problem. He wants her judgment. He desires it. He longs for it. And number two, he has no way to interpret what that judgment is. Right? She didn't shake his hand. And then he suddenly realizes that if she would have if there would have been a handshake, that probably wouldn't mean anything. He would have just felt better. Without the handshake, he doesn't know what to think. He's still in the same place where he was, which was having no idea what's going on. He wanted her judgment to assure him, and the lack of judgment leaves him totally in the dark. More so. Does that make sense? Page 29 with Fräulein Bürstner. He's trying to explain what's just happened in her bedroom. And he says, "There was a commission of inquiry here," Kay added. "Because of you," the young woman asked. "Yes," Kay replied. "No," the young woman cried with a laugh. "Oh, yes," said Kay. "Do you think I'm guiltless then?" Right? So once again, he's asking for an external validation of who he is internally. "Well, guiltless," said the young woman. "I don't want to make a hasty judgment that might possibly have serious consequences, and I don't really know you, but it does seem that you'd have to be a serious criminal to have a commission of inquiry come right down on you from the start. But since you're free, you can't have committed any serious crime." Her answer has absolutely no bearing on whether he's guiltless, right? She just says, you haven't committed a serious crime. You're not truly evil. But there's a whole huge space between malevolence, true evil, serious crime, and where Kay is. And he wants somebody to tell him that he's innocent, that he's not guilty. And nobody can do that for him, no matter how hard he looks. "Yes," said Kay, "but it may have been in the commission of inquiry, or that the commission of inquiry realized I'm guiltless, or at least not quite as guilty as they thought." Okay, so again, he's willing to admit a range of guilt, or what guilt means, but he's trying to use an extreme sense of guilt to clear him entirely, and it's not working for him. He has the guilt, and he doesn't know why. Fräulein Bürstner says, "The court has a strange attraction, doesn't it?" And that's another thing that you'll notice as you continue to read through the novel, the way that the court is attracted to the guilty. There's a strange attraction that we have to being judged, to judgments. We feel guilt. We know our guilt, even if we haven't done anything truly wrong, and we're attracted to those who can judge us, hopefully to exonerate us. But sometimes that's harder to find people whose judgments you can really take at that value. Does that make sense? Okay. Page 31, he starts taking liberties. Fräulein Bürstner's tired. Kay insists on rearranging her room for his performance, quote unquote, right? So he's going to perform for Fräulein Bürstner, the court of inquiry that had taken over her room, in spite of her protest that she's tired. So Kay ends up shouting at some point. He wakes up Frau Grubach's nephew, the captain, and then offers that Fräulein Bürstner can just accuse him of having assaulted her. Right, like, oh, just explain the yell, just explain that, I was assaulting you and everything will be okay. And Fräulein Bürstner says this: "I appreciate your suggestions, but I can't accept them. I can take full responsibility for what happens in my room and face anyone. I'm surprised you don't realize the insult to me in your suggestions, along, of course, with your good intentions, which I certainly recognize." So that's Fräulein Bürstner's point of view. And it's in contrast to Kay's own behavior. She takes responsibility for herself. She takes responsibility for what happens in her room. And she's willing to face people on her own without seeking external help or validation. Right? She's just willing to own it. Kay isn't. Okay? And so even through these series of minor characters, do you see how Kafka is setting up a contrast, differentiating Kay, who always needs some other people's opinions, from other people who are just willing to go things on their own? Does that make sense? Okay. All right. More liberties that he takes. At the end of the scene, quote, "Kay rushed out, seized her, kissed her on the mouth, then all over her face, like a thirsty animal lapping greedily at a spring it has found at last. Then he kissed her on the neck, right at her throat, and left his lips there for a long time. After taking these liberties, she, quote, allowed him to take her hand for a kiss, as if she were unaware of it, and entered her room with a bowed head, end quote. Did he do anything truly wrong? Is there evil at work here? It's an uncomfortable scene. It's not nice. It's not kind. Is it truly wrong? Depends who you ask, right? But it is a sexual assault. It's rude. It's a deprivation of her autonomy, right? She's being denied the right to refuse. His entrance into her bedroom, his presence against her body. Kay forces himself into her room, onto her person, and alters her disposition, right? Before she was willing to stand up and say, yeah, I'll take individually on my own terms. After, she submits to him with bowed head. And in performing an empowered position, he wishes to take power over the other one in the room, right? Kay understands that he's in a power vacuum. He feels powerless. He feels the lack of autonomy, but the way to get it for him is always relative to somebody else, right? He never takes power for himself, in himself, or through himself. He always mediates his sense of power relative to the others that he can see around him. Does that make sense? It's not an internal thing for Kay the way that it should be. It's always relative. It's always external. It's always against the others that he sees in his world. We okay with that? Okay. All right, next chapter, there's the initial inquiry. So he's been called into the court for an interview, or the initial inquiry, and so he's arriving. Page 38. Some sort of stubbornness had prevented Kay from taking a cab. He had an aversion to even the slightest outside help in this affair of his. Right? And that's true in a way. Like, he's very resistant to get help in a way, but on the other hand, he's always seeking outside support at the same time in ways that he doesn't admit to himself that he's doing. Okay? Continue reading. He didn't want to enlist anyone's aid and thus initiate them in the matter even distantly. Nor, finally, did he have the least desire to humble himself before the commission of inquiry by being overly punctual. Right? He doesn't want to give them the respect of being on time. He doesn't want to humble himself. He's still being defiant and resistant, which is not the same as being autonomous. Right? So autonomy, having the right to refuse, means that you own that right as you go through life. Defiance means that you're always accepting external impositions against you. You're reacting against them. You're defying them. But even in the choice to defy, you're already acknowledging the power that they have over you. Right? That's the difference between autonomy and defiance. Does that make sense? Okay. Of course, he was now running to get there by 9 if at all possible, although he had not been given a specific hour at which to appear. Right? So he just assumes that he needs to be there at 9 o'clock on a Sunday morning, and so he's running to get there on his own time, but not be too on time, like he doesn't want to be there 5 minutes early, but he doesn't want to be there too late. All right. So page 39. He was annoyed that they hadn't described the location of the room more precisely, right? They just give him an address, and there's this huge apartment complex, just all over the place, 10-minute house, like a row house, something like it's big. He was certainly being treated with strange carelessness or indifference. Then he went up the first set of stairs after all, his mind playing with the memory of the remark the guard Willem had made, that the court was attracted by guilt, from which it actually followed that the room for the inquiry would have to be located off whatever stairway Kay chanced to choose. So his reasoning goes as follows. If the court is attracted to guilt, and they think I'm guilty, therefore, wherever I end up going is going to be the place where I should arrive. It's kind of a nightmare logic, but it actually works for him, because he ends up finding the room that he's supposed to go to after all, and then they chide him for being late. And it works. And there's a strange way that Kafka's novels make that kind of sense. Right? The kinds of causes that produce effects are very, very different than the kind of rational cause effects that a Cartesian or a scientific system would allow. Right? What causes things shifts. The kinds of effects that matter shift. They're different. And that's one thing that Kafka is very, very good at playing with in his fiction. It's not quite consistent, but its inconsistency actually seems to make more sense in a way to being human than a world that lived by an absolutely consistent frame of rules. Not everything in our lives makes sense in a consistent sort of way. A lot of things are various. Does that make sense? Okay. Page 44. Here's where he starts performing for the crowd. Quote, "The people in the party on the left, who are in fact less numerous, may have been no more important than those in the party on the right, but their calm demeanor made them appear more so. As Kay now started to speak, he was convinced that he was expressing their thoughts." So during this interrogation, he gets into the room, and there's a little stage, and then there's a whole bunch of people over here, and a whole bunch of people over here, and they're all talking amongst themselves. And he feels that those on the left are more sympathetically inclined toward him. They just are, in that kind of weird way that you just kind of know somebody gets you. They kind of get it. He understands. So he starts performing for them and ignoring the other ones. Page 49, "The two parties, which had appeared to hold such contrasting opinions before, now mingled with one another, some pointing their fingers at Kay and others at the examining magistrate. So his initial interpretation of difference, right, these are on my side, the other ones are against me, then totally dissolves as the two parties mingle together." Page 51, there's a verdict from this speech. Quote, "I just wanted to draw your attention to the fact," said the examining magistrate, "that you have today deprived yourself, although you can't yet have realized it, of the advantage that an interrogation offers to the arrested man in each case." Kay spends his entire time accusing the courts of being horrible. Right? I mean, you can't do this kind of thing. Look how poorly I was treated. They ate my breakfast. They came into somebody else's room. It's just absolutely terrible. And so he goes on and rails against the court. He does not submit to interrogation. You know, he's in a mode of defiance, not a mode of autonomy. And the examining magistrate just kind of sighs and shrugs and says, "Well, it could have been better. You chose otherwise." But we don't know what choosing otherwise means, right? I mean, because it's still in this vast nebulous framework that we don't know about. We're not sure what the stakes are. We don't know what the consequences are. Neither does Kay. Any questions with that? Okay. Page 55. We're now in the empty courtroom, the student offices, the next chapter. Page 55. Kay volunteers to appear, but there's no court. Kafka writes, "Kay waited from day to day throughout the following week for further notification. He couldn't believe that they had taken his waiver of interrogations literally, and when the expected notification had not arrived by Saturday evening, he took it as an implicit summons to appear again in the same building at the same time." What Kafka does is describe Kay as a performer who's looking for an audience. The reader sees how he's already internalized and appropriated the norms of the court. There's overt compliance, in his overt compliance, just as his overt rebellion testifies to his submission. Right? It's two sides of the same coin. While he's in there, there's no court. He talks to a woman who's in there that he had met earlier, who'd made a scene before. And he notices some law books that are laying on the desk, and he goes to look at them. This is page 57, and he says, "Kay opened the book on top, and an indecent picture was revealed. A man and a woman were sitting naked on a divan. The obscene intention of the artist was obvious, but his ineptitude was so great that in the end there was nothing to be seen but a man and woman emerging far too corporeally from the picture, sitting rigidly upright, and due to the poor perspective, turning toward each other quite awkwardly." The second book, a novel entitled, quote, "The Torments Greet suffered at the hands of her husband Hans." "So these are the law books they study," said Kay. "I am to be judged by such men." It's interesting. I think there's a couple of different implications. Number one, the law here seems as sexually directed as Kay does. It also emphasizes voyeurism. It also emphasizes the power invested in watching from a distance. Right? That's the kind of power at play, but it's sexually directed. It's not neutered. It's not neutral. The law is gendered in its manifestation in a really weird, violent, creepy way. And Kafka does nothing with that. He just lets that sit there. And we don't know what it means that the law is full of obscenity. And we don't know how the law treats women. Although we can guess maybe at how the law treats women in Germany then and in America today. There's no equality under the law. And that's a hard truth to have to face about law and about power. Ready to move on? Page 61. He's talking about the woman, right? And so the woman is married to the court usher, and she wants to help him, and so he's talking to her, and he says, 61, the woman did tempt him, and no matter how hard he thought about it, he could see no good reason not to give in to that temptation. The fleeting objection that the woman was ensnaring him on the court's behalf, he easily brushed aside. How could she ensnare him? Right? And so the woman is tempting him. He's like, yeah, it's a woman. She's here. She's tempting me. Great. You know, can the court ensnare me? I don't see how. But he doesn't ask what it would mean to become ensnared in the court. Right? He's assuming that the answer is no, but he doesn't know what the snares are. He doesn't understand the stakes or the implications. He just takes what's present for him at the moment, what appears to be there, and wants to have it for him. Given his ignorance of the court and his trial, it isn't surprising that he's easily able to brush aside his worries and go back to his kind of de facto status quo approach of taking what's present and not worrying about the future. Okay? And do you see how Kafka takes that characteristic and builds it into his character and decision after decision after decision? Does that make sense? Okay. Page 62. And there was probably no better way to revenge himself upon the examining magistrate and his retinue than taking this woman away from them for himself. Then the time might come when, late one night, after long hours of exhausting labor on his false reports about Kay, the examining magistrate would find the bed of the woman empty. And empty because she belonged to Kay. Because this woman at the window, this voluptuous, supple, warm body in a dark dress of heavy, coarse material, belonged to Kay and to Kay alone. It's an absolutely horrible and revolting passage. Right? And so when he's thinking about this woman, he's not thinking of the woman as a human being or as a person, right? His immediate indication is that the woman has value to others, and there are others that he doesn't like, right? And that's her value. She doesn't have value in and of herself. She has value only because other people in the external world value her.
Yeah, it's a male daydream.
Pretty much. You know, and so when Kay thinks about it, he thinks, oh, this is great. I can have my revenge. How can I have my revenge? I can have it by possessing this woman.
Right.
It belongs to Kay and Kay alone. Forgetting, of course, that no human can ever belong to another human. I mean, the whole thinking process is absolutely reprehensible. But again, as we learn from the very first sentence, Kay is not guilty of anything truly wrong. Right? Thinking this way about women is not truly wrong. He's innocent. Somebody must have slandered him, right? Because this kind of behavior is totally socially acceptable. We allow this to happen in our world all the time. We're complicit in it. It occurs, and we don't stop it. It's not truly wrong.
It's not truly wrong.
Well, I mean, is it evil? I mean, is there worse? Are there worse things?
Sure.
Sure, right? There's no serious crime. I mean, it's just a mistake. You know, it's just what happens, right? It's what one does. It's okay. It's not truly wrong. It's just a little wrong.
It's not punishably wrong.
It's not punishably wrong, right? I mean, that's the difference, right? And that's part of what Kafka's sketching out. That what we want to say is, oh, I'm not evil, right? I'm not a bad guy. And Kay's not really a bad guy. He's not a very good guy, but he's not a bad guy, like capital bad. He's just a guy. And the fact that his being just a guy is kind of awful is a hard truth to have to face about this book, especially when it regards how he deals with power and how he deals with women. Does that make sense? But it's looking at what we don't find to be evil, what isn't truly wrong, what's not punishable, what you don't have to feel guilty about socially. You might individually, but socially, it's still not wrong to think that you possess a woman. That's hard. And that's hard for me to swallow. And I'm not a woman. I mean, but that's hard. So the logic of retribution is, again, though, tied to a logic of possession and ownership. And that's what Kay comes back to. I mean, he works at a bank. He's all about owning. He's all about possessing and what those kind of property rights are like. Kay isn't worried about the justness of his trial, which he shrugs off dismissively. His automatic response is to get revenge for the inconveniences that have intruded into his life, and that's a revenge that he wishes to mediate through controlling the body of a woman. The desire is not for the woman, it's only that those attached to the woman suffer. Page 64. So the law student who clerks for one of the magistrates comes in and just takes the woman, like picks her up and just wants to run out the window with her. And here's what happens. Then let him go, and I hope never to see you again, said Kay, in enraged disappointment, and shoved the student in the back so sharply that he stumbled for a moment, only to leap higher in the air with his burden and enjoy it not having fallen. And that's just one of those life of Kafka moments, right? Where, like he's carrying this woman in front of him. He gets pushed, he stumbles, and then he leaps for joy in spite of his burden because he didn't fall down. It's physically impossible, but it's just a really delightful kind of image, although it's also still kind of creepy because you just have the student coming into an apartment, taking a woman who's married to somebody else and going out the window to take her to a judge. Kay followed them slowly. He realized that this was the first clear defeat that he had suffered at the hands of these people. The key term is clear, because we've already shown how Kay has acknowledged the power of the court over him in a number of times, right? There have been a number of pretty clear victories from the reader's perspective. This is just the first one that Kay notices as a clear victory against him. The key thing to remember is that resisting against power, again, is a way of surrendering to its authority. And the only way to remain free from power is to walk on an axis alien to it, right? To pursue a path of autonomy rather than a path of power. As soon as you want to take power over others, you're already implicated in this kind of system. As soon as you want to claim rights, property rights, whatever, it's all part of the same system, because you're always relying on external forces to validate that which you claim a right to. And that's part of being in a society, but it's the kind of part that we don't like to think about and we don't like to talk about. And that's part of the reality that Kafka is trying to bring to the foreground rather than where it usually is in the background. Does that make sense? Okay. So then he eventually gets into the law offices, and on page 69 he starts looking at the other defendants. And it's early on in the trial. Kay is rather arrogant and pompous, as we've noticed, and he says, "How humble they must be." "Yes," said the court usher, "they're defendants. Everyone you see is a defendant." "Really?" said Kay. "Then they're my colleagues." And so he, on the one hand, wants to put himself above them, and on the other hand has to recognize that they're his equals or his peers. And he turned to the closest one, a tall, slim man whose hair was already turning gray. "What is it you're waiting for?" Kay asked politely. The unexpected question, however, confused the man, which was even more embarrassing since he was obviously a man of the world who would certainly have retained his self-confidence elsewhere and did not easily relinquish the superiority he had attained over so many others. But here he couldn't even answer such a question and looked at the others as if it were their duty to come to his aid, and as if no one could expect an answer from him if such aid were not forthcoming. And that's Kay's view of the other defendant that he's looking at, which seems remarkably like a portrait of Kay himself. So Kay is engaging in an interrogation, right? He's interrogating one of the defendants. And Kafka shows how Kay's colleague, the man of the world undergoing a trial, responds. The man that Kay interrogates is used to having power over others, and his response is to turn and look around as though others should help him, as though anybody else had a duty to help him in his hour of need. He knows no answer for himself. He can't answer Kay's question about what he's waiting for. He needs other people to be responsible for him. And that's one of the disadvantages of that kind of office power, right? Where you're in the middle of the room and you have an assistant and an outside door line and whatever those things are. Somebody else is always responsible for protecting you. You don't have to protect yourself. Does that make sense? Okay. Kay, however, on page 74, becomes overcome by the air in the offices. Like he just gets really faint and weak, his head starts swimming. And it says, Kay didn't reply. He was too embarrassed that this sudden weakness had placed him at these people's mercy. Although he puts himself in their mercy all the time, right? It's just this time it's physical, and this time he doesn't want to do it. He understands that he's doing it, and he resists that, as opposed to all the other times where he doesn't understand that that's what he's doing. Moreover, now that he knew the cause of his nausea, he didn't feel better, but instead a little worse. It's just a little snapshot of submission. Page 78, it gets worse, in a way. Quote, he was at their mercy. If they let go of him, he's being carried by them, right? So he's just being literally dragged through the law offices. If they let go of him, he would fall like a plant. Kay felt their steady tread without matching it, for he was practically carried along from step to step. He realized at last that they were speaking to him, but he couldn't understand them. He heard only the noise that filled everything, through which a steady, high-pitched sound like a siren seemed to emerge. Louder, he whispered with bowed head, and was ashamed, for he knew that they had spoken loudly enough, even though he hadn't understood. So although Kay is carried step by step, he's not ashamed of it. Shame emerges when he knows that he lacks understanding that he should have already had. He's ashamed about what he fails to know that he should have known, and not for his physical weakness, and definitely not for his reliance on others. He's totally fine relying on others. He's ashamed of his lack of understanding. He's ashamed to have his weakness, his lack of understanding, presented to others.
But at that stage, he had been informed that the person with the nice suit had all the information about the trials.
Mm-hmm.
And he says that he doesn't know he's there. He never asked him. You know, but at that stage, he's really upset that he doesn't understand. But when he could ask to understand something, he missed the opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
He just didn't do it.
He doesn't do it. He's ashamed of a lack of understanding, but he lacks the courage to pursue it.
Mm-hmm. But don't you think that maybe he wants to be examined because of his relationship to women?
I'm not sure that he understands that his relationship with women is wrong. Like, I don't think he gets it.
Okay.
But I think he does want to be examined only so that he can have other people say that he's not guilty.
That he's okay.
Yeah, and that's what he wants. He wants a judgment. He wants the verdict of being innocent. But he doesn't want to understand what he's guilty of first. And that's part of the dissonance that Kafka introduces in the first third of the novel. Does that make sense? All right. Here are some of the implications that I drew out just from this first third. Kafka's view of the world is a world where power can become projected over and against individuals. And it shows our initial reaction to that power, which is defiance. Right? If somebody expresses power over or against you, our instinct is generally to defy it. You know, we're Americans. We have, amendments and rights and stuff, right? Like, come on,
You should have been in Chile in 1970.
Yeah, I'm sure that it depends on the kind of power.
That was quite different.
Yeah.
Well, in Nazi Germany too, but sometimes something is imposed over you that you have no control over.
And the stakes are very, very high. Like in America, there's a certain respect for defiance, I think, culturally, where that becomes an expectation.
Well, that's what I was thinking, yeah. Yeah, so almost watching a man who on television had just shot a policeman, and I thought, my God, he's living in a different universe. There's no connection there. Or you hear sometimes someone wants to be their own lawyer. The things that they say, you think, my God, he sees things from
a very different perspective.
Yeah.
Joseph K's defiance never reaches near that level, I don't think.
Probably true.
No, I mean, he defies in the way that he's used to defiance being offered, which is through a lot of words, right?
But there's also what's going on is that he's never been detained, really.
No.
He goes back to his home, to his office, does everything. It's kind of a chore to go on Sundays to this trial.
Yeah, and what happens, I mean, the kind of arrest is different, but what happens is that there's a sense of guilt that just covers over all of his life at that point, right? So he's allowed to go through his life as normal with the addition of just this little sense that he's been accused. And it's that accusation that sticks against him, and it permeates every single aspect of his life, except he doesn't actually let it, And he just keeps doing things that would seem maybe less than okay, maybe fairly reprehensible.
Out of line.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he's kind of detained by everyone watching.
But he's free. But he's... And I think part of what Kafka's looking at, too, is what freedom actually means. Given that we're always surrounded by people watching, given the fact that we might feel guilt for who we are, what our lives are like, given that, what does it mean to be free? What does it mean to be doing something truly wrong? In a world where there's a lot of stuff all the time that's actually truly wrong and totally acceptable. How do you live in that kind of a world? So Kay's defiance generally occurs primarily through belittling those who claim power over him. Right? Anybody who would claim power over him, he belittles those people, right? And says, like, here's all the stuff that's wrong with them. But he nonetheless submits or consents consistently in little ways that acknowledge that he lacks power. Kafka's discussion seems incredibly relevant in a world where one's actions and opinions on Twitter, on Facebook, or whatever can prove incredibly damning, right? And so you hear people who just tweet something stupid, and then they're just flagged mercilessly because of that. And it doesn't matter that it was just a stupid joke meant for like 3 people. You know, if the Twitterverse gets a hold of it, or if Anonymous gets a hold of something, you're flagged, and there's no escape. So that's the world of power that we live in now, which is this weird kind of decentralized power, where everybody's always watching, and we offer up to them things for them to judge, voluntarily, all the time, right? We make our actions public actions, all the time.
But we also know that if we go, say, to Facebook, you are giving a lot more than you think you are.
Yeah.
Okay, and you start getting offers for things because of the people that you associate with. That you don't know where they come out of the blue, it seems.
And it's a weird world of algorithms. And algorithms are a weird world that don't make causal sense either, right? They're just guesses that power wants to see if you'll comply with. Economic power.
Guilt by advertising.
Yeah. But beyond Twitter and beyond Facebook, there's overt power like police, and police have been in the news a lot in the last year. There's covert power, like not even just Facebook, but insurance agents and banks, credit card companies. I mean, there's a kind of power that associates with those kind of economic bastions also, to which we continually submit because we feel like we lack options. I hate having insurance, but I need to drive, so I have insurance. Right? I don't like having to pay the bank money, but I want a house, so I do, because there's no other choice. And I find myself submitting all the time to structures of power that I don't really like, because I want the benefits of doing so. And I make those kinds of little compromises all the time, because they're worth sacrificing my autonomy for. And when I make the choice, I choose to diminish my autonomy. I make myself less independent all the time, because I like the benefits. There are perks that come along with it.
It's nice to have the fire department come and call.
Certainly is. It's nice to have roads and bike trails, and like there are a lot of niceties. There are good things that come with being part of a society, but they always encroach just a little bit, and it comes from every side. Just a little bit takes a little piece here and a little piece there. It seems as though Kafka suggests that Kay's recognition of this kind of power comes, at least in part, because it's a kind of power that he's comfortable with and familiar with when wielding it against others. The implication is that remaining freed from this kind of power requires that one not use it to gain advantages above others, right? And so part of why Kay is so familiar and acknowledges and submits to the kind of power that the court has is because that's the kind of power that he uses all the time in his everyday life. And he just knows it. It's like the back of his hand. Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you for coming.